diagnosed with cancer is a frightening experience.
Being called a monster.
Making millions of dollars.
To say that he was coerced? What about us? I was coerced.
This has to be one of the most twisted cases of medical malpractice and fraud I've ever seen. It was actually one of the largest medical fraud cases in the United States. I'm not even going to dignify this man by calling him a doctor because he was most certainly the furthest thing from even thinking of having that as a title. So we will be addressing him by his first name. This is the story of Farid Fata, the doctor who poisoned his patients for money. Welcome, my name is Petal Palmer, and on this channel I post videos of true stories involving medical mysteries and crime. If that is something that sounds interesting to you, feel free to check out my other videos and consider subscribing if you like it. Alright, let's get into this case. Farid Fata was born on March 31st, 1965 in the Farshima town of Lebanon. He grew up quite religious. His family was part of the Melkite Catholic Church, and as a kid he always had his eye on the medical field. After obtaining his medical degree from Lebanese University in 1992, a 27-year-old Farid would move to the States to continue his journey on becoming a practicing physician. And he would do this in none other than the city that never sleeps, New York. After completing his residency at the Maimonides Medical Center in Brooklyn from 1993 to 1996, he would soon move to Manhattan to complete a hematology-oncology fellowship at the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in 1999. It would be just a year later, in 2000, when Farid would pack his stuff up and move to Danville, Pennsylvania, to officially become an attending physician at the Geisinger Medical Center. While this was a great gig for the new attending physician, Farid always wanted more. He wanted his own freedom to run things how he wanted, so he would stay there for 3 years before taking the plunge and starting his own practice. That's when he opened up the Michigan Hematology-Oncology Clinic, also known as MHO, in Rochester Hills, Michigan. And MHO would absolutely skyrocket. Over the next decade, they would grow 7 different locations throughout the Metro Detroit region of Michigan, and by April 2009, he had completed another one of his goals when he became a naturalized citizen of the United States. Essentially, Farid was successful in all of his endeavors, and he was honestly just living his best life alongside his wife Samar and their 3 children. As a hematology-oncology physician, Farid specialized in treating blood cancers. As a businessman, he was opening up medical facilities left, right, and center. He owned his own laboratory, his own pharmacy, and he even had his own radiation treatment facility. He just had so many of his own businesses, he couldn't have possibly ran them all by himself. So fortunately for him, his wife would help work on the business aspect of his practices. She became the CEO and CFO of his company. Farid had even directed his own cancer charity called Swan for Life, where he often spoke at a variety of events. Farid was known for having a more aggressive approach to treatment. He believed in giving patients higher doses and more frequent infusions of chemotherapy, as he would cite that this was the European or French protocol. But whatever it was, it seemed to be working because he would become one of the most highly renowned physicians in the area. He grew his clientele to over 17,000 patients, and he built this high reputation as one of the best cancer specialists in the Metro Detroit area. Patients who were diagnosed with cancer, at the very least, had some sense of comfort knowing that MHO was the place to be treated at. But all clearly wasn't all sunshines and rainbows, because it would be in 2007 when Farid was hit with his very first lawsuit. And this lawsuit came from one of his patients, Maggie Dorsey, suing him for medical malpractice. In 2004, a 32-year-old Maggie had been diagnosed with multiple myeloma by Farid at MHO. And it would be shortly after her diagnosis that she would be put on his European or French protocol. And this consisted of doing intense chemotherapy for a duration of 7 months. And these 7 months would be possibly one of the worst 7 months of Maggie's life. Throughout this period, she would go in for regular infusions, and each and every time her body would continue to deteriorate. She had started losing function in her hands. She was unable to walk. Doing everyday tasks like cooking, cleaning, writing, typing, and even combing her daughter's hair had started to become quite unbearable tasks for her to do. She had tremors, she had had weakness, and these symptoms actually still continue to this day for her. While her family and friends would go out for events, she would instead be left bedridden, unable to join in on life activities. And this was especially hard for Maggie because she's a mother to 9 children. That's 9 children she had to miss out on basketball games, baseball games, going to the park, or like I mentioned, doing her children's hair. And the treatment just continued progressively getting worse. It actually got so bad to the point where one day Maggie had to be hospitalized because the pain was just unbearable. And it was after this point that Maggie had decided to finally get not only a second, but a third opinion because there was no way she could continue to subject herself to Farid's treatment. So she goes in to see these new physicians, they order some tests, she goes home, and when she goes in to see them again for her follow-up, they would tell her, Maggie, you do not have cancer. In fact, you never had cancer at all. And while Maggie has to now obviously process this information, she would also have to begin the process of figuring out legalities because this was a clear case of malpractice. How on earth could this doctor not only diagnose her with cancer that she didn't have, but have her on one of the most ruthless treatment protocols invented? So she and her husband would soon get a lawyer, and shortly they would sue Farid. And in 2009, they would settle the case outside of court actually, as it was believed that this misdiagnosis was just a mistake, which is quite the mistake if you ask me. But Farid would admit to no wrongdoing and they would both part ways. Maggie would not have to go in for treatment at MHO anymore, and Farid would continue his practice. And just to add insult to the injury, after all of this, Farid would actually end up sending Maggie a medical bill. I don't know what made him think she should even have to pay a bill after all of that, but she obviously did not have to pay it, and that was presumably the end of their interactions. But not everybody was convinced that there was no wrongdoing involved in this case. On March 31st, 2010, an experienced oncology nurse named Angela Swantek would go into MHO to interview for a job with Farid. She interviewed on one day, that went well, and it would be the following day she would return to shadow a nurse. She looked forward to this position because she knew how highly respected Farid was as a physician, and she was just impressed with all of the work he was doing for patients in the community. But when she would get there on that second day, she would be shocked with the care that these patients were being provided with. She noticed that in his clinic, patients were being given extremely long infusions of chemotherapy drugs. She specifically noted that an infusion of a drug that would normally only last 5 minutes was given via IV drip for a whole entire hour at this clinic. Additionally, another drug called Neulasta, which is meant to stimulate the creation of white blood cells, was given on the same day as chemotherapy when it's usually meant to be given 24 hours after. Angela had been working in this field for a while and has worked in some of the top cancer centers in the area. And in all of her years in this field, she has never seen anything like this in her life. She would honestly just describe these treatments as just plain wrong. She just had this feeling that this was nothing short of fraud. So Angela would decline the job, leave the clinic earlier than they initially planned, and on April 14th, 2010, she would contact the state authorities to file a complaint about Farid's practice, something she's never done or even had to think about doing in her over 2-decade career as a registered nurse. In this letter, she would share the violations that were being made in the clinic and express the need for an investigation. She would write, and I quote, "I feel this physician is doing his patients more harm than good. Patients are being harmed." And after a long wait, it would be over a year on May 13th, 2011, when Angela would finally get a reply. But the wait wasn't even the worst of it all, because in the letter she received from the Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs, they would claim that violations of the Public Health Code cannot be established, and the investigation would be closed, allegedly without the state even reaching out to contact Angela about it. So essentially, despite Angela's efforts, the state didn't see anything wrong with Farid's practice, and he would go on to continue treating his patients. And even worse, he would open up more clinics. And surprisingly enough, one of the clinics happened to be right across from where Angela was working at. Every day, Angela would continue to witness these healthcare violations in Farid's office, but there wasn't much she could really do about it. She couldn't just walk in and say, hey, get out of here, don't trust this doctor, his protocol is excessive, especially with the high reputation this man already had and the clear lack of support from the state authorities. So instead, Angela would just mention little things to her coworkers like, hey, why is Farid giving them such a large dose of this drug? Or shouldn't that normally only last for 20 minutes? And she was just hoping that word of mouth would continue to spread until everyone was on to him and finally the authorities find out and actually do their job. But this plan unfortunately wouldn't work because Farid would go on to continue his practice. However, that was all until 2013 when finally there would be a major breakthrough in this case. In 2012, 53-year-old Monica Flagg had went in to see her primary care physician for a regular checkup. So at this appointment, her doctor did some blood work, ran the test, and they waited for the results. And when the results came back, her doctor had noticed that there was some kind of abnormality in her blood work. And so her doctor would say, look, your blood work is looking a bit abnormal. You'll need to see a hematology-oncologist. I'm going to write a referral for you to go see Farid Fata. So Monica now has to go in shortly after to see Farid at the Cretenton Cancer Center, which was one of the locations Farid had operated a private clinic at. So in July 2012, she arrives at this clinic. He would do his assessment and he would look at her chart. And it was at this point he would straight up just tell her, Monica, you have multiple myeloma. And as if that wasn't hard enough to process, he would then go on to explain that although they caught it early, her case was so bad, she would not only need to go through an extremely aggressive protocol, but she would need to be put on a lifetime of maintenance chemo in order for any chance of survival. Monica at this point is quite shocked, and it didn't help that she just felt these weird vibes from Farid. Everyone she knew had always talked about how amazing Farid was and how he's the best doctor, but as Monica would sit face to face with him and listen to him speak, something just seemed off, but she couldn't tell what it was. So, of course, Monica, who had no symptoms and was feeling generally very well before coming in, is now stunned to hear her diagnosis, but being that her primary care physician had referred her to Farid and he just had all these amazing reviews, all these clinics, and overall great success with patients, Monica was ready to just hop into treatment to just start it and get this thing over with. So over the next several months, Monica would continue treatment with Farid, and almost a year later on July 1st, 2013, she would have her first round of chemo. But this would also be her only session of chemo because this was the day Farid's little plan would begin to unravel. Just hours after leaving the clinic following her infusion, Monica had went home and presumably planned to spend the rest of the day relaxing and managing any side effects. So she goes upstairs to her bedroom, and the first thing she wanted to do was unpack her suitcase before settling in. But while she is in the process of unpacking this suitcase, Monica suddenly trips, falls to the ground, and immediately hears two loud cracks. She knew instantly that she had broken her leg, and she just started screaming out for help. So while in excruciating pain, Monica's husband Steve would immediately take her to the Cretenton Hospital Medical Center in Rochester Hills, where she would presumably be met by Farid to oversee her care. But on this day in particular, Farid had actually been away on vacation in his native country, Lebanon. So instead, Monica was going to be seen by one of Farid's employees, Dr. Maunglay, as he was the doctor on duty at the hospital and he had been doing rounds on Farid's patients while he was gone. So Dr. Maunglay would come in her room, assess her, ask questions, and he would start going through Monica's chart. But as he is reading her chart, Monica would notice that he just had the strangest look on his face. At this point, Dr. Maunglay just started asking Monica a series of questions, presumably things like, what were your symptoms? Notice anything unusual? Did you see anyone else? Just trying to get a feel for how she came to find out her diagnosis. And Monica would answer all of his questions. Dr. Maunglay would leave the room and she would spend the night in the hospital. But for Monica, something did not feel right. After that strange look on Dr. Maunglay's face and just the series of questions he was asking, it seemed like Dr. Maunglay was convinced that she actually did not have cancer. And 2 days later, on July 3rd, her suspicions would be confirmed. Monica had a friend visiting her in the hospital when Dr. Maunglay would come to her room and immediately ask the visitor to leave. And with the look on his face, Monica knew that she was going to be in for some news. So he shuts the door and he immediately just says, "Monica, you're 51 years old. You're extremely active. You're a professional. You're healthy. And you do not have cancer. I work for Dr. Fata, and you need to never go back to him ever again." Dr. Maunglay had already had suspicions about his boss Farid, so on that Monday when Monica came in and he checks her out and reviews her chart, he just knew that something wasn't right. So what had happened was he left her room, and it was that next day on July 2nd that he decided to do some investigating himself. So he heads to the MHO files and he starts reviewing Monica's record. While he is looking at her health history and her recent test results, he would notice that there were no results backing up that she had multiple myeloma. In fact, there were no results backing up that she had any type of cancer. At this point, Monica is absolutely ecstatic that she's finding out that she doesn't have cancer. She doesn't have to go through grueling treatment anymore. And she's just happy to know that she's overall healthy. But Monica realizes, oh shoot, I just went through all of this for absolutely no reason. And rightfully so, she's angry that this even happened. And interestingly enough, Dr. Maunglay was actually due to leave MHO in August after finding out that Farid had actually been lying that the clinic was enrolled in some type of professional quality program when they really weren't. So this lie and Farid's weird behavior was just something Dr. Maunglay couldn't get behind, and he was just ready to get out of that environment. But now, after discovering that Monica, a healthy woman, was not only misdiagnosed but placed on an unnecessary chemo protocol, Dr. Maunglay felt that he needed to stop Farid and get him out of practice. He knew that while horrible enough, Monica's case alone was not enough evidence to get Farid for misconduct and get his clinic shut down. He needed to find more cases similar to this. So Dr. Maunglay would start going through other patients' records at MHO. And as he is doing this, he is stunned because he would find several instances of not only unethical, but just downright illegal practices by Farid. Farid was giving several patients unnecessary drugs in cases where those drugs were not needed at all. One of these treatments was called IV immunoglobulin therapy, or IVIG, which is intended to treat patients with specific immune deficiencies. In the charts that Dr. Maunglay was reviewing, these patients had no result indicating that they needed IVIG at all. There was no medical basis supporting that they needed any of it, yet several of these patients were being provided this drug at MHO. At this point, Dr. Maunglay just had to let somebody know what was going on. So he approaches a nurse and a nurse practitioner at the clinic. He explains everything he's observed, and this persuades them to confront Farid. So once they finally get to talk to Farid about this odd use of IVIG, Farid would actually back down and say, "Fine, I won't use IVIG anymore," and they left it at that. But Dr. Maunglay was not convinced in the slightest. If anything, this just further confirmed that Farid was a fraud. Because any physician who is honest and is confident in their protocol would likely stand firm in their belief that their treatment method is necessary. But the fact that this objection by a few of his staff made him crumble was a telltale sign that he knew what he was doing was wrong. Throughout the next few weeks, word must have been spreading like wildfire because several employees would start to put in their letters of resignation without any explanation of why they were leaving. The clinical staff and the doctors of MHO just wanted to get out of there. And at this point, the clinic's office manager, George Koreche, was quite puzzled as to why so many staff members were leaving with no explanation. So one day he would approach Dr. Maunglay and just ask him, hey, like, why are you leaving the clinic? Like, what's going on? And Dr. Maunglay would straight up just tell him, look, Farid has been insistent on aggressive chemo protocols for even patients who don't need it. And I just can't get behind that. Now, while George is listening to this and hearing these allegations, he was actually not too convinced at first. He was just thinking about how this couldn't have possibly made any sense because there were so many other physicians and clinical staff providing care and overseeing patients. But then he started to think back and remembered that many staff had actually been expressing concerns about Farid's aggressive protocols. At this point, George decided, shoot, let me conduct my own investigation myself. And so he started contacting many of the staff and would interview them. Throughout these interviews, he would notice that Farid's consultation to treatment ratio was much different than that of the other doctors. And he would go back to Dr. Maunglay, and Dr. Maunglay would tell him, look, I think you should check out Farid's use of IVIG, because just before this interview, not only did Dr. Maunglay know about Farid's unnecessary use, but a nurse had discovered that just in 1 week, 38 of the 40 patients who were given IVIG did not qualify for it. A whole 95% of the patients given this drug did not need it at all. At this point, George had all the information he needed, and he was immediately off to the U.S. Department of Justice with this information, to which they would interview him on August 2nd, 2013 for further questioning. Shortly after, federal agents would start interviewing several staff members of Farid's clinic, and it would be on the morning of August 6, 2013, when the FBI would raid Farid's offices and home, and he would be finally arrested on 19 counts of healthcare fraud and other crimes. So Farid is brought into custody, and he's initially held on a $170,000 bond, which is mind-boggling because we're talking about a man who has swindled tens of millions of dollars. He definitely has $170,000 to get out. So federal authorities would tell the judge, look, this man has about $9 million ready to get out and go. I think you should raise his bail. And once the judge realized, oh yeah, and he's probably a huge flight risk, Farid's bond was raised to $9 million, and he was held in jail until his trial. Throughout this period, federal investigators would amass evidence of a whopping 553 victims Farid had not only bullied, but deceived into receiving unnecessary chemotherapy treatments that they didn't need. For years, not only had he been falsely diagnosing people with cancer, but he was giving patients who did have cancer unnecessary amounts of drugs in the name of the European or French protocol. Regardless if somebody had cancer or not, he was wrongly treating these patients. And all of this was done just so he could get a big check. Like, he wasn't making enough money running so many businesses with such a large clientele. Farid had been billing these patients' insurance companies like Blue Cross Blue Shield Michigan and Medicare for all of these treatments. And using the proceeds from Medicare and the private insurance companies, he would then pour money into his own diagnostic testing facility to further continue his orders of unnecessary tests. So essentially, this was just a toxic feedback loop. And this scheme would allow him to amass $34 million in fraudulent and unnecessary claims. And if that wasn't bad enough, he had also been receiving kickbacks from 2 local hospices as they had been illegally paying him for referrals. These are referrals of patients he was unnecessarily harming with the unneeded use of poisonous drugs. Just absolutely sick. And a lot of these drugs that he was prescribing were not just used for treatment, but he was also deliberately prescribing the most expensive supportive care medications. Like I mentioned, IVIG, but he was also prescribing things like IV iron salts and hematopoietic growth factors, all which can range from between $1,000 to $10,000 for just one dose. Like, these medications are not cheap in the slightest. Just anything he could get his hands on that he knew would make some cash, he was giving it out. So finally, Farid would be charged as the United States Attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan, Barbara McQuaid, who described this case as the most egregious her office had actually seen, would obtain a series of indictments culminating in 23 counts charging Farid of healthcare fraud, conspiracy to pay and receive kickbacks, money laundering, and unlawfully procuring naturalization. The last one was added as it was figured that Farid had been concealing the extent of his fraud from immigration authorities when applying for his naturalization and citizenship, because I don't think he would have been granted it if they knew he was poisoning patients for money. I don't know, just a thought. There was just heaps of evidence against him, and if convicted of all charges, he would be facing a maximum of 175 years and a potential to get his naturalization revoked, meaning he would possibly get deported back to Lebanon if ever released. So Farid decided to take a plea deal, and on September 20th, 2014, pleaded guilty to 13 counts of healthcare fraud, 1 count of conspiracy to pay and receive kickbacks, and 2 counts of money laundering. And on July 15, 2015, Judge Paul Borman would sentence Farid to 45 years in federal prison and would order him to undergo treatment for substance abuse. Additionally, Farid was ordered to forfeit millions of dollars in assets from his fraudulently ordered treatments, as the court had discovered he had made at least $17.6 million from his crimes. This money was believed to likely be paid as restitution to former patients or their families. And the hospice that was allegedly paying Farid kickbacks for patient referrals, Vitas Health Corporation Midwest, agreed to pay $200,000 in a settlement to resolve those allegations, but claiming to not have done anything wrong. Many would have questions on how this could have been possible. How was it that there were so many staff employed, but Farid was able to continue his practice for so long? But this was just a matter of the power, manipulation, and control he had. Many of Farid's staff mainly consisted of rotating between low-paid international physicians who were sponsored by him to complete more of the clinical documentation aspects in the clinic. Farid would instead regularly see over 70 patients in a given day, allowing patients to avoid being in contact with any of the other physicians. Farid would hardly take any vacation time. He would make late-night rounds at the area hospitals he was admitting patients at, and nurses at these hospitals were often instructed to only call Farid about questions regarding his patients. He'd instruct them to contact no other on-call physicians, just him, because he knew his treatment protocol and he couldn't mess up any of these treatments for his patients by talking to another physician. Okay, but how about the insurance companies, the Medicare? Well, Medicare auditors are more specialized in detecting checklist-based instances where products are billed but not received or delivered. But when it comes to inappropriate practice patterns, like giving patients unnecessary treatments, like in this case, they're not as able to detect these cases as it would likely require medical knowledge of these treatments, which is something that they're likely not specialized in. This allowed him to continue his fraudulent practices for as long as he did. At his sentencing, about 22 victims would come forward to read their impact statements on how Farid had negatively affected their lives. And it's crazy that even though 22 is a lot of people, that's only a fraction of the amount of people he's poisoned throughout the years. Farid would express remorse, saying that he is horribly ashamed and apologizing that he let sin enter his heart. He said, and I quote, "I misused my talents because of power and greed. My quest for power is self-destructive." And he let the court know that he prays daily to repent. But no amount of prayer would take away what he did to his victims. Out of the hundreds of victims, many of those who would express how Farid had affected their lives would include Terry Michelle, who was falsely diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and treated with chemotherapy and radiation. Dr. John Pilligan, a pathologist who had actually met Farid at a board meeting and was really impressed by his work. His daughter, Elian, would speak on behalf of him after he had passed away from being overtreated by Farid after getting in remission from stage 4 cancer. Christopher Sneary, who was placed on an extensive treatment plan for cancer that should have typically been easier to treat. Michelle Menarino, whose mother passed away in excruciating agony after requesting a change in her treatment plan. Tim Parkin, whose wife Geraldine spoke on his behalf as he was too angry to come into the courtroom after being overtreated for lymphoma by Farid. Patricia or Patty Hester, who was a former ER technician and was diagnosed with myelodysplastic syndrome, which was a terminal cancer, and was given unnecessary treatments when all she had was anemia. Rose Colombo, whose daughter is Therese Dardwatke, spoke on her behalf as she had passed away after 10 months of Farid failing to diagnose her stage 4 cancer and giving her 31 unnecessary treatments. Ted Lowen, whose wife Patricia spoke on his behalf after passing away on September 2, 2014 from being overtreated by Farid. Steve Skripchuk, who was given 25 chemo treatments in 6 months after being falsely diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Piero Zanotti, whose daughter Laura Stedfield confronted Farid in court after he had passed away from being overtreated for lung cancer. There was Donald Crabtree, who was actually in hospice during the time Farid had been caught after he was being treated for lung cancer when he really had a form of kidney cancer. His wife Marietta would read the statement he wrote just before passing on December 29, 2014, stating, "I am in hospice. It is my dying wish that Mr. Fata be in prison for the rest of his life." And this is just a small amount of the hundreds and potentially even thousands of people Farid had wrongly treated. While they've officially identified 553 victims, it is believed that there actually could have been many more, considering he has worked with over 17,000 patients. Many were hoping that Farid would have actually gotten the maximum allowed of 175 years, but hey, considering he was 50 at the time of sentencing, 45 years just might be a life sentence in itself, but he definitely needed a lot more than that. In fact, in 2014, nearly 5 years after Farid's conviction, victims were said to still not have received the compensation they were entitled to from the damages Farid had caused. He made about $34 million from insurance companies and was required to pay $12 million in a restitution fund to victims, and even 10% was supposed to go to Angela Swantek, the nurse who had initially called him out after being rejected by the state. But patients and families of the over 700 applicants were facing delays and even had some of their applications rejected when trying to reach out about assessing their funds. Some of this had to do with the U.S. District Judge Paul Borman ordering $26.4 million to be paid to insurance companies and requesting $4.22 million from the government to pay to the individual victims. But many of the victims just wanted to recover, not only financially, but also emotionally, and these delays didn't help them do that in the slightest. And interestingly enough, when Farid had arrived in court on January 24, 2017, he actually appeared to look bald, thin, and very frail, which was ironically similar to what his patients looked like while enduring his treatments. Also, during his trial, his wife had actually divorced him and fled back to Lebanon with their 3 children. Kind of a clear case of what goes around comes around. Likewise, as the case was further investigated, they were just finding so much of Farid just trying to make as much money as possible and just trying to buy the most expensive things. In 2010, Farid had sent an email to his financial advisor that he was trying to purchase a $3 million castle in Lebanon. And in addition to this, he was just asking if he could take money out of the trusts he had, and he was even threatening to stop purchasing medications from companies he was working with if they didn't donate to his charity. Like, this guy was really just trying to get as much as he could. It's just really sad what greed and an evil mind can do. Like, I myself continue to go through so much while doing chemotherapy, and that's me on a known protocol. These patients were being overtreated and some given treatment that they didn't even need. Like, I can't even imagine what that would have been like. And I hope Farid has some time to think about what he did while he spends a good 45 years in prison. But that's it for this case. Let me know what you think about this story. Thank you for watching, and subscribe so you don't miss any other stories of medical malpractice, crime, and mysteries. Bye now.